This is an interview with Charles Connor, July 31st, 2010. Okay.
So usually, Charles, we start this process really talking about how you became involved in organ pipe in this regard and resource management and the science of it, and sort of when did you get interested in doing conservation work and scientific efforts in particularly organ pipe, but, can you give us a little bit of your history, where you came from, where you started?
Sure. I'll try and keep it relatively short because I came about this somewhat circuitously, to put it mildly. I was a math major in college at Caltech, graduated in 1975, and then ended up in the electronics business for 10 years, even though I have no training in electronics, and then ended up becoming interested in the environmental movement while I lived in the Bay Area, and then moved to Tucson and got involved with Earth First. And while backpacking here with some of my Earth First friends in 1987, looking very unkempt and not like a very likely candidate for a Park Service job, at the end of our hike out here, our weekend, I walked into the visitor center and asked the question that a lot of people ask of the person at the front desk, who happened to be Caroline Wilson, the chief of interpretation, and a very wonderful person. Asked her the standard question of, how do you get a job here with the Park Service? And she told me that there are lots of people start off as a volunteer, and as it so happened, they had a volunteer position, an intern position with the SCA, the Student Conservation Association, open for that very summer. This was in June when I was asking her, and they had a position open and no applicants. And so, with the permission of my wife at the time, we had a little bit of money set aside. I spent the July, August, and September. I just did a 3-month stint out here as an SCA. And then that kind of got the ball rolling. I ended up getting a GS2 seasonal part-time fee collector job at Saguaro East, and then I was a volunteer at Death Valley on a short term, also another 3 months, in the VIP program. And then just to try and enhance my chances to get into something interesting like a backcountry ranger job, I went to Santa Rosa, to the Seasonal Law Enforcement Academy in Santa Rosa. That was a very interesting experience. Nothing came of it because I think I asked too many controversial questions, but I got all A's and second in the class in marksmanship and all that stuff. And it's funny because people were very heavily recruited from that class, and obviously my name ended up on a list, not the right list, but it was a very interesting experience. And then, as it turned out, the person who I was working for, I split my time when I was an SCA here in 87. I split my time between resource management and interpretation, working for Caroline Wilson in the interp end of it. But my boss in resource management, who was Roy Irving, they were looking to hire a seasonal position in 1989, and he remembered the work that I had done for him. I helping him set up weather stations here in the park, which tapped on my electronics background, and so he made a point of hiring me in April of 1989, and I have been here ever since. And the interesting thing about all of that also is that in 1989, our long-term monitoring program was just barely getting going. The inventory phase was just being wrapped up by all the principal investigators, most of them from the University of Arizona. And my boss then, who was Jim Barnett, told me very wonderfully that these people weren't going to be around here much longer, and that I should get out and learn everything I could from them, because the idea of the inventory monitoring program was that there would be a 3-year inventory period, and then monitoring protocols would be developed that park staff could implement. And so that's all started in 1989, and in a big way over the next since until a couple of years ago when security issues and some management changes really put a crimp in our program. Although we're still struggling along. It's about half what it used to be, but we're still plugging away at it after 20 years.
And the inventory, can you give us a little background as to how that got started? Because that was a pretty novel concept. There are not too many parks that are doing quite the depth that you guys had done. And was that related to the Biosphere Reserve as well?
Yeah, it was, and other people can give you the details on that better than I can. My understanding is that people, I don't know, some people, a combination of Bill Micas, who was our chief of resources at the time and later was our chief of maintenance, and Harold Smith and some other people, including a lot of folks from the university like Peter Bennett and Mike Kunzman and some other folks. I don't know, the idea was somehow generated, and this happened right before I got here, of doing something that was completely novel in the Park Service, and that was a inventory and monitoring thing that was not tied into a national program, but that was actually going to be congressionally funded just for organ pipe, and had a very novel, holistic approach instead of doing like many parks would do, of focusing on the so-called charismatic megafauna or whatever. That this program would just really was bottom up in terms of the ecology, dealing with plants and rodents and lizards, and it's tried invertebrates. That turned out to be too problematic, as it has been everywhere, just because it's too complicated. But and weather, of course, the weather stations were tied into all of these study sites. It was originally called the Sensitive Ecosystems Program, and then later on the name got changed to the Environmental Monitoring Program, and there were the reasons for that were just not really all that important. But yes, the amazing thing was that it was an approach that nobody else in the country was doing, except for a couple of I forget what it was called. There were some trial nationally organized programs that were sort of getting going, and for reasons that I'm not sure of the details, Organ Pipe managed to secure the funding to get this program going just all on its own, and I'm proud to say that I can claim that I've been a big part of keeping it going for all these years.
Are you able then to see the changes that has happened in flora and fauna as traffic has increased in that, more illegal and more Border Patrol traffic has increased in the park? I know the park's changed a good deal. Is the kind of program that you have now able to monitor the impact of some of those changes?
Well, yes, I would think so. And again, I'm the field technician, so I'm the one who's out there getting data and feeding the database, which is a extremely important job, because without good and reliable and consistent data, you really can't say anything. And I leave it up to the experts to decide what it all means. I have to tell you that, and this may disappoint the larger public out there, that in my humble opinion, the main driver of what's happening out here is the weather. And certainly the illegal activity and the Border Patrol activity has its impact, but it tends to be extremely localized. Obviously, driving a vehicle across the desert is not doing that particular spot any good, nor are campfires or wood cutting or, layup sites and trash. But overall, on a landscape basis, I don't think that stuff, in my opinion, really has any effect at all, or the effect is negligible, except on specific spots where the actual, where the impact is happening. But on a landscape level, I would say, to me, it's negligible. And again, the weather, if challenged. Well, that changed drastically several years ago, and then for a while, it was utterly forbidden to do cross-country cross-border travel officially at all. And so I just reverted back to doing it as a volunteer. And interestingly enough, to be perfectly honest, the management at the time, not the current management, but the management at the time tried very, very hard to forbid me from doing the work I was doing in the Pinacate, even though I told them it's like, hey, I'm doing this with no government equipment, no government vehicle, on my own time vehicle, expenses, whatever. But they tried to come up with rules to make it to where I could somehow be sanctioned for doing that. They never pursued that, fortunately, and so now things have, in the last couple of years, things have changed in that there is a procedure now for doing cross-border work, as a in a government capacity, but it's so cumbersome a process that I just decided that I couldn't do it. I mean, you have to get approval weeks in advance, and it has to come all the way from Washington, and anything overnight is just even more difficult to do. And you have to have somebody along with you, and radio and sat phone contacts and all of this stuff. And it's just, I personally decided that just wasn't worth it, even though I could have at least been paid for it and had a government vehicle to use on some fairly rough roads down there. But I just personally decided that just was, it was personally obnoxious and really unworkable, and even in a practical sense it was unworkable, because some of this stuff just has to be done fairly opportunistically, because an awful lot of the monitoring we do is dependent on the weather almost day to day. So sometimes you just have to jump at an opportunity, which is what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going down to the Sierra del Rosario, which is the dune area way out on the west side of the Pinacate. I'm meeting up with a Pinacate employee who's a friend, and an ex-Pinacate employee who now lives in Tucson. And we're going to go out there and set up a rodent site and go road cruising for snakes, check the weather station that's out there. And then in the morning, if the weather is reasonable, I'm going to do a lizard transect. So it's going to be kind of try and get 4 things done. We'll get at least 3 of them done. And that's that.
The other thing, Charles, that...
Nice way to spend a weekend.
Yeah. The other thing, Charles, is that in those early days when a lot of that outreach was going on across the border, the park was bringing researchers up from Pinacate, Isabel Granillo being one of them,
right,
and others. Is that kind of happening, the kind of interchange happening at all?
Well, not so much, and that's partly just a matter of the fact of just people coming and going. We're pretty, we're very welcoming for people from Mexico coming up and working here, and some of it just has to do with there's been a lot of staff turnover. They're not, their economy isn't any better than ours is, to say the least. So that interchange is still there in terms of a potential. It's not happening quite like it did, but it's not a matter of policy, I don't think. But it is interesting that the management here keeps insisting that the Pinacate be able to carry on this monitoring program on their own, and that's fine with me, but it's just the reality, again, of changing and or non-existent personnel. It just makes it impossible, and I am utterly committed to the consistency and continuity of data collection. And you can't collect yesterday's data tomorrow or today's data tomorrow. So it just has to be done, whether there's somebody down there to help or not. And a couple of times I was on the verge of saying, okay, I'll go train this person, and then that person left a month later. So it's just. And one time when I did turn over some of the weather station work to the folks down there, they just didn't do it, and there's suddenly giant holes in the data started appearing because they in one case they couldn't figure out how to open up a combination lock. That was so bad. It's not because they're dumb or anything. I think it's just a different generation, but I found that to be rather remarkable.
Are you seeing any volunteers taking up any of these jobs? When we talked to the people at the International Sonoran Desert Alliance, they talked a bit about volunteers going to the Pinacotes, but they seem to be moving brush back and forth and other things. They're not engaged in research or monitoring in any of these ways?
Well, there is. I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm just wondering if there's a possibility that some volunteers might take up the mantle, and I'm wondering if you see volunteers doing work in the Pinacotes, especially international volunteers, people from Aho.
Yeah, there is some of that, and I can't speak to the details of that because I'm not really aware of the details, but I do hear periodically that there are other folks from the U.S. I don't know if they're from anywhere else, other than Mexico, of course. But there are other folks from the U.S. Who go do work down there, but I'm not really clear of what all that encompasses. I think it's more project oriented, and some of it may have to do with outreach. Certainly, they're very much into. Putting out educational stuff, and that's something again that I'm not really involved in. I'm more in the natural resource monitoring end of it, and there's not a whole lot of that going on that I know of involving volunteers. Although there is, we do aerial pronghorn surveys down there, but that's actually done as an official Park Service thing, once every other year or so, and. There is some work done with bats down there, and that's about it. There may be other things. There's not a whole lot that I'm aware of, but then again, I pretty much concentrate on the long-term monitoring stuff that I've been doing all these years.
I understand. It's interesting that they're doing the pronghorn surveys when there really isn't any transport or movement of pronghorn anymore, is there?
Well, those animals move around a lot. I'm not an expert on pronghorn, but we do have there is a connection between the pronghorn population in Sonora and in Arizona. Even though, of course, a big problem is that the Highway 2, that kind of slices through it all. But there has been a long term, and again, I think it's every other year. There are aerial surveys. Which again I found kind of amazing this last time around, because here I couldn't get permission to do a day trip to one of my study sites, but meanwhile 2 or 3 of our staff are going down paid to spend 4 days and nights down in Mexico and flying in airplanes. So anyway,
I find that kind of interesting as well.
Well, it's all for a good cause. I just thought it was somewhat contradictory. It's a pet peeve of mine. People care a lot more about charismatic megafauna than they care about, mice.
So, Charles, you said that the resources are suffering from climate change. Has there been a dramatic change in what you're finding when you're doing your transects and your site studies from 10 years ago when you started this?
There's, again, I only have the anecdotal stuff that I just have from just, being out there and seeing it. But there have been some really good studies done with our data, thank God, because that's what it's there for. I often say we're providing answers for questions that haven't been asked yet, but when they ask those questions, we have the data to help answer them. And there have been some interesting trends in changes of species composition. Again, I'm thinking of lizards and rodents mostly. Certainly, as everyone knows, the last few years have been pretty dry, and there has been, climate change is you need long-term data, and we have 20 years of really good long-term data, but even that is only kind of a starter. But every year you can add to it. Makes it that much more valuable. Certainly there has been a trend of not a rise in high temperatures, but a rise in low temperatures, like fewer nights of freezing temperatures, and that's pretty ecologically significant because that has an impact on plants and insect species, for instance. So, I mean, yeah, we've noticed some trends, but again, I leave most of that to the scientist. I'm the technician. I'm not trying to duck the question, but I would never presume to speak, more than I know. But I can tell you plenty about what I do know.
Go ahead.
So I just want to always add one other thing, maybe anticipating something you may ask me at some point here, and that is that one really sad impact that we're seeing here related to the border is the border infrastructure itself. I mean, I fear that we're going to end up having a triple fence like they do in Tijuana or something. The Homeland Security is basically taking full advantage as much as they can of the 50 or 60 feet that they have from the border fence, and that area is one of the most beautiful bosque areas just east of the port of entry. Just got completely nuked the other day. I mean, it got turned into wood chips. So the Border Patrol does not hesitate to exercise their authority over what they can do, and I have that problem when I'm out walking in the desert to some of my study sites. And the next time I go out there to a site that I was out at, weeks before, I'll see ATV tracks that have clearly been following my footprints, and so that is, we work. It's really funny. It just shows the value, as one of my previous bosses, Brian Milstead, who you really would have a really great conversation with, said one time that monitoring should not be based on management objectives, because management objectives change over time, and if you have the monitoring if the monitoring protocol sort of changes with the whims of management objectives, then you lose your consistency completely. And an interesting example of that right now is just that we were all concerned about border impacts relating to illegal aliens and all of the damage that they were causing, and now it's Border Patrol impacts that are by far and away our biggest headache here in terms of any kind of human-caused, on the ground disturbance.
You mentioned the feet around the fence, around the barrier, but also these towers for the virtual fence. Tell us a little bit about that impact.
Well, that's still yet to come. I mean, certainly they're visually obtrusive. We managed through a lot of, again, this is higher levels of management, managed through an awful lot of negotiation to get the number of towers down to far fewer than what was originally proposed. And of course, we're sadly suffering from the fact that this is an unproven thing. The whole program's been put on hold, except for the 2 sites that already got started, and we're one of them. So it's still going full steam ahead here. The impacts are as yet unknown because they're not really up and running yet. There's infrastructure issues. There's also noise issues. We are embarking on a really interesting program that has applications far beyond the towers and everything of soundscape monitoring, which is a really, really fabulous Park Service program that's nationwide. And we got into that, or are getting into it, based on highway noise and also the noise from the towers, because they have generators. And it's a huge wilderness intrusion, or it certainly has the potential for that. Of course, the fact that we don't let anybody into the wilderness anymore anyway makes it kind of a joke, in my opinion. But anyway, assuming we do let our visitors and American taxpayers having access into the park, then these towers will seem rather strange. The idea that there's constant surveillance everywhere in a wilderness area is a little sort of compromises the whole idea of wilderness, I think. But right now, the towers, there aren't that many of them, and they're there. The whole system is not running yet. And so it's just...
it's hard to speculate.
It's unclear what the full results are going to be of that.
On just one follow-up question here, some people have expressed the hope that in 3 or 4 years, this whole problem may get what they call under control, and that border entrance will be stopped before they actually get into the park, and that damage will therefore be reduced and the park can go back to something like normal? Is that a hope of yours, or do you think that's a realistic hope?
Well, it's a nice hope. I think that the solutions are going to be economic and political. I mean, I don't think there's any way to stop people from crossing the border if they want to. It's just, it's the whole concept of sealing the border or securing the border, to me, is a joke, and anybody who spends any time down here could realize that it's impossible. So you have to stop people from, stop the demand. If there was a more political and economic solutions, and I have lots of ideas on that, none of which I haven't heard already from well-reasoned people, I would think. But no, I don't think infrastructure is going to really change the situation very much. And certainly, as a lot of people say, why doesn't the Border Patrol patrol the border, which is a very good idea, but they, even with the constantly increasing personnel that they have here, because it is constantly increasing in big, like leaps and bounds, it's still never going to be enough. People who want to come across, they're very determined, they're very resourceful, and they're going to come across. And that's part of the problem with the towers that worries me, is that it's like once they're across and they're out in the desert, then that would imply to me that somebody is going to go hop on an ATV or worse and go chase across the desert to catch them, which is only going to create more damage. So I don't know. Like I said, the solution is political and economic, and in the meantime, we're caught in the crossfire here. I go down to Sonoita at least every other day, if not almost every day, and I never go down there without seeing people who clearly are, gearing up and or just waiting around to cross the border. I mean, it's just obvious. There are whole enterprises down there that cater to the cross-border people, from selling them carpet shoes and camouflage packs to, water jugs and cans of tuna or whatever. I mean, it's just right there, completely obvious, and it doesn't seem to matter how horrible the conditions are here environmentally in terms of, stressful on the human. I told some guys the other day, these young guys, they were obviously gearing up to go across, and I told them, no vale la pena, mucha migra, mucha víbora, mucha calor, and they just smiled and, thank you. And
yeah.
But the fence is not going to stop them. The virtual fence is not going to stop them. Absolutely nothing is going to stop people from crossing if they are determined to cross. I can guarantee that. But I wish they would stay home and fix their country. I love Mexico and I love Mexicans, but they're not helping their country or their families by coming here into the U.S. They're not helping the U.S. either, despite what people say about taking jobs that nobody else wants. If there were fair labor laws, that would not be an issue on both sides of the border. But anyway, that's venturing off the subject, I'm sure.
Not really. I'm want to, though, sort of stress that one of the things we're really interested in are these sort of binational connections, and you've spoken very informatively about how it's affected your monitoring activity. But I'm wondering about if you might have any other comment about sort of the rich tradition, at least when Wendy was in the region, of people connecting back and forth across the border and looking at it as a single eco-region and working together on this. What's your reflection, just as an observer, and I understand this isn't your main business, but what may be happening to some of those relationships?
Well, actually, I've been pretty well involved in a lot of that as long as I've been here, and I have to say that, conceptually and in principle, it's still a very vibrant and strong relationship. It's just the practicality of it that is just created some difficulties. I mean, the folks from the Pinacate, when they want to come up here to visit us, they just get in the car and come up here. But we cannot even our superintendent, I'm sure Lee Bison must have told you this, that he can't even drive 30 miles down the main highway south of the border to Pinacate headquarters to talk to them. He can't do that without getting, advance permission and paperwork and all of that stuff. So, but again, in terms of the principle of it, I'm optimistically believing, and I think realistically so, that it's all still there. We have a really great relationship with the Pinacate. Really outstanding relationship. Again, it's just these practical security issues that have, made things a little bit difficult or worse. But no, our relationship and our commitment to sharing information and the fact, and realizing that, that we all work and live in the same ecoregion, I think that's still very, very strong. I will say, however, the minor complaint that I think sometimes it's interesting that some managers, and I'm talking mainly about people who aren't here anymore, I think, love to take credit and bask in the glow of all this international cooperation, but then they really don't help in making that international cooperation actually happen. And again, I don't really understand why that is. I mean, security is one thing, but I think I don't know, it's a certain amount of hypocrisy involved too. Because if we are working together, then we should be working together. So so it's not perfect, but again, I think that generally speaking, the whole philosophy of cooperation is definitely there. It's a feel-good thing for everybody, and I think it's mostly sincere.
Good. Okay. Well, that's really helpful. Sort of building on what you just said, it would seem to me then that you think that much of the credit for good international